Welcome to the virtual introduction to the Animal Kingdom Lab. In this video, we're going to cover the 9 major groups of animals. So within the animal kingdom, there are 9 major groups, which we refer to as phyla. So the way that we classify living things is by a system known as taxonomy, and there's various levels to it, the highest being kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So we're looking at the second level of that classification system, which is a phylum. So the 9 groups of animals that we're going to cover are each considered a phylum. One of those 9 phylums, or phyla, is called the chordates, also known as chordata, which includes all vertebrates. Now, vertebrates are animals that pretty much have a backbone, a spinal column, and a vertebrate that is segmented. Usually a skull and a skeleton, an endoskeleton that's composed of either cartilage or bones. Most vertebrates also have a dorsal nerve cord in their nervous system, a mouth/throat, and a notochord. The other 8 groups that we're going to cover are invertebrates, and they primarily lack the characteristics that I just listed. So here you go. These are the 9 phyla, broken down by whether they are invertebrates or vertebrates. I'm going to say those for you. So the 8 invertebrate phyla are Porifera, also known as the sponges, the cnidarians, the flatworms, with a more technical name being the platyhelminthes, the nematodes, also known as the roundworms, the annelids, also known as the segmented worms, mollusks, arthropods, and echinoderms. Those are all invertebrates. They lack a backbone. And then lastly, the 9th phylum, the only one which is composed of vertebrates, are known as the chordates. And I like to think of the chordates as the type of organisms you would find at the aquarium or at a zoo. So that includes more familiar animals like birds, amphibians, mammals like yourself, bony fishes, cartilaginous fishes like sharks. And as we go through these 9 groups, we are going to focus on how to classify these groups. We're also going to look at their structure. So we're going to go in a largely evolutionary sense here, starting with the most primitive, the oldest animal group, Porifera, which includes all sponges. So this is a marine group of organisms, meaning they live in the ocean. And they're the oldest group of animals, and they lack a lot of other traits that more complex animals have. For instance, they don't even have tissues. It's kind of like a colony of different types of cells here in the sponge working together as a community. So they lack tissues. They also lack body symmetry. So there's no way that you can cut a plane through this organism and get 2 mirror halves. Okay, so they're asymmetrical. The way they eat is they largely draw in water through tiny little pores that you can't see here, and they have cells that have something called a flagella. It looks like a tail or a whip, and they expend energy to move that tail to draw water into these pores, and as they draw water in, the cells feed off of primarily dead organic material floating around the ocean. It could be any type of food molecule floating around, tiny molecules, and also plankton. So they're filter feeders. This is just to show you how that works. So here's a pore in pink. Those are the tails I was talking about, the flagella. It whips those so it can draw water in, and it basically creates this current that goes in through the pores and out through the top of the sponge. Our next group are the cnidarians. These include jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. This is another phylum where most of the species live in the ocean. It's a marine phylum. And instead of being asymmetrical, they have something called radial symmetry. So that is to say, if you were to cut a line down the center point of the sea anemone or the jellyfish, as long as you cross the center, you're going to get roughly 2 equal mirror halves. So they have many planes of symmetry. That's radial symmetry. And all of these organisms have a mouth that is surrounded by tentacles. And those tentacles are specialized cells that have the ability to sting prey and to defend the organism. So if you were to zoom in at the microscopic level on those tentacles, they're basically little structures called nematocysts that are like little harpoons that, when mechanically signaled to do so by touch, for instance, they fire these harpoons, oftentimes with venom, to protect the jellyfish or sea anemone and to help it acquire prey, acquire food. So here on this slide, we see one type of cnidarian. These are 3 different types of jellyfish. So they have the medusa shape. So you can see like the bell, the top is up on the top and the tentacles are hanging down. Sea anemones and corals are like an upside down jellyfish, the polyp shape. So the tentacles are facing up and the bell part is usually stuck to a substrate like a rock, for instance, or to the skeleton of the coral. Okay, so here's a polyp, like a sea anemone or a very tiny coral polyp. Here is the jellyfish shape. Here's one of those nematocyst structures that helps it sting. So you might wonder, well, how come coral doesn't sting me, or how come a sea anemone doesn't sting me like a jellyfish does? Well, if you touch a sea anemone, it probably feels sticky to the touch. It's trying to sting you just like a jellyfish is. It's just that its nematocysts aren't strong enough to penetrate your skin, so you're not feeling it. But they all sting in the same manner. So this slide is on a particular type of cnidarian, in this case corals. They're very important cnidarians because they form a marine ecosystem, oftentimes in shallow tropical waters, and that ecosystem is called a coral reef. And I want you to realize that corals, think of it as a tiny little sea anemone living in one of those little holes. Okay, each of those little holes has a little polyp. And oftentimes coral lives symbiotically with another organism, algae. So the reason that coral reefs are so vibrantly colored is because you're seeing the color of the algae that's actually living inside the coral. It lives inside the coral cells. So it's a symbiotic relationship because the coral gets food from the algae, products of photosynthesis like sugars, and the algae gets a nice, protected, safe place to live, maybe some minerals and nutrients as well. And together they create this huge structure that can be built for centuries or thousands and thousands of years, a reef. And a reef is very important because it's a very diversified habitat structurally where many different organisms can live and have protection. Many types of fish, mollusks, arthropods. So they have great biodiversity, and I encourage you to watch this little video on the bottom. And one last thing about corals. So here's a dead coral. So what are you looking at here? You're actually looking at the skeleton that the coral polyp secretes. So it's not living, it's limestone, it's calcium carbonate. And the polyp, the coral itself, lives inside those little holes, and it secretes this skeleton around it to protect it. On to our next group, the flatworms. Many live in the ocean, but not all of them do. They include the planarians. One thing I want to say, and also the tapeworms, one thing I want to say about the flatworms is they are the first group of animals to exhibit something called cephalization, meaning they have a head. You can kind of see that here with this worm right here. It has two primitive looking eye spots, and it looks like a head, you know? So it has a concentration of nervous tissue and a concentration of sensory organs like the ability to sense light, like I said, a brain, all concentrated in one region. So this is the first animal to have a head. Next group, also composed of worms. These are the nematodes, also known as the roundworms. These are worms with a more cylindrical shape, very small, largely live in soil. And one interesting fact about the nematodes is this is the first group of animals to have what we call a complete digestive tract, meaning they have this long tube in their body with one opening for food and another for disposing of waste. That's really advantageous because it allows you to digest and absorb various nutrients along the way as you process food through that digestive tract. So this is really the first group to have that. And not only that, they also have something called a body cavity. So they're the first animal to have space between their muscle layer and the digestive tract. So there's just an empty gap in between, and that allows for organs, for instance, like digestive organs. So we as, mammals, as chordates, have expanded on that body plan. We have a body cavity, and we have all kinds of things in that cavity, like a liver, a stomach, pancreas, lungs, a heart. So they're the first to have that empty space in there so you could have accessory organs like that. Our next group, the last group of worms, these are the segmented worms, also known as the annelids. And they're called so because if you look at them, you can see these repeating segments. And that has greatly enhanced their ability to move, their locomotion. And also, many later groups of animals have expanded on this body plan of segmentation. So for instance, you as a chordate, you're segmented, like your vertebrate, your backbone. If you think of like an arthropod, like an insect or a lobster, for instance, they've taken segmentation and they've like specialized each segment to do a particular function. Like for instance, they might have swimming legs, a tail, antennas, walking legs. So most important, this is the first group to have segmentation, and it includes the earthworms and leeches. The next group is a very diverse group known as the mollusks. And some characteristics that tie together all of the species in this group is that they have a soft body, which usually has a muscular foot. So think of like a snail, and the snail's moving around. The part of the snail that you see that's slimy and moving around, that's the foot, okay? But all of these species have that. Many of them have shells. Also, many of them have a feeding organ called a radula, which is like a serrated knife, which helps them to break down food. So squid have that, snails have that. Like for instance, if you let a snail crawl on your arm, you can feel it scratching you with that radula, that knife-like structure. And more importantly, what are some examples of mollusks? Well, there are three major groups. The first being the bivalves. These are organisms that have a shell, pretty much. So that includes clams, scallops, oysters, mussels. Secondly, we have the gastropods, which includes slugs and snails. Abalone as well. And then third, we have the cephalopods, which includes a group that has lost their shells. Very smart group as well. Great predators, the octopuses, and squids. So these are all mollusks. Next, we have the arthropods, the most successful group of animals in terms of their sheer numbers on the planet. Some characteristics that tie together the members of this group is that they have segmentation, like the earthworm, but each segment is specialized for a particular function. Not only that, it has jointed appendages coming off of each segment. And all arthropods have something called an exoskeleton that surrounds their body. And it's made up of a sugar, a polysaccharide called chitin. So for this phylum, the arthropods, we're going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to look at 5 major classes within the arthropod phylum. And those classes are the crustaceans, the centipedes, the millipedes, the insects, and the arachnids. Beginning with the crustaceans. So they have all the other traits that we just listed off that all arthropods have. In addition to that, they have their head segment fused with their chest, thorax segment. They have gills, and they have the most specialized appendages out of all arthropods. So for instance, if you look here at the lobster, you can see what I'm talking about. There are some segments with jointed appendages for swimming, some for sensing the environment, some for walking around, some for defense, some for eating. That's what I mean by specialized jointed appendages. This group also includes crabs, shrimp, and barnacles. Next group of arthropods, we have the centipedes. You can see their segments here. That's 1, 2, 3. At each segment, they have 1 pair of walking legs. Centipedes are also predators. They have venomous claws. Third group are the millipedes. A little bit different in that they have 2 pairs of walking legs per segment. Our fourth group of arthropods, the largest class of animals on the planet, are the insects. And insects all have 3 pairs of locomotive appendages, or walking legs. So you can say they have a total of 6 legs. They usually have wings and usually have antennae as well. There are various orders within the insect class. You are not responsible for knowing the names of those orders, but I will cover examples of insects that fall into those various orders. So you do need to know that all of these species that I cover here are insects. So the first, the technical term is Diptera. These are called true flies. They have 1 pair of wings, and as the name implies, it includes the flies and mosquitoes. Second group called Coleoptera. Similar, but they have 2 pairs of wings, 1 harder pair on top and a more delicate lower pair, sometimes used for flying, on the bottom. These are also known as the beetles. Group number 3, which includes the butterflies and moths, are an order of insects that have wings with scales. Interesting fact is their wings are actually composed of sugar. So we talked about how arthropods have that exoskeleton composed of a sugar. This is part of that exoskeleton, their wings themselves. Then we have our last order of insects, Hymenoptera, And these include insects that have thin, transparent wings. Some of them have lost their wings or only have the wings on certain sexes, like for instance the ants. But this group includes bees, wasps, and ants. So insects, also very important pollinators as well. And here we have our last class of arthropods. These are the arachnids, different from the insects in that they have 4 pairs of walking legs, for a total of 8 legs. These include the spiders, scorpions, and ticks. And our last group, our last phylum of invertebrates, are the echinoderms. This is another marine phylum, and they're unique in that they move around using water pressure, using something called a water vascular system, where they utilize structures called tube feet, like little suction cups, to move around and to hold on to rocks, for instance, and to eat prey. They also have radial symmetry. The sea star has a unique form of radial symmetry called pentaradial symmetry, where there's actually 5 planes of symmetry. This group also has and secretes a skeleton composed of calcium carbonate, the same compound that corals secrete. And this group lastly includes sea stars, also known as starfish, sea urchins, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers. Now we're ready to move into the last major group of animals, the chordates. And remember, chordates are vertebrates. So we're going to learn about 7 classes of chordates, shown here. 4 of those classes, called the tetrapods, which includes aves, which are birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Okay, so these are tetrapods, meaning they have basically a total of 4 locomotive appendages. So like yourself, 2 arms and 2 legs. So all members from those 4 groups are tetrapods. They're also largely land-dwelling organisms. So our first class within the chordate phylum is known as Agnatha. And this is a superclass of fish that lack jaws. And they also do not have appendages, so they don't have fins, for instance. These include the lampreys and the hagfish. And you can kind of see, looking at its mouth, it looks kind of scary, kind of odd. It doesn't have a jaw to clamp down and bite. Our second class of chordates are known as chondrichthyes, also known as the cartilaginous fishes. These include all sharks and rays, and they have jaws, and they also have paired appendages known as fins. Their mouth is considered to be ventral, meaning it's down below, like facing down, whereas a bony fish, which we'll cover next, has a terminal mouth, which is facing straight out. So a few examples here. We have a bat ray on the left and a leopard shark on the right. Next, we have the bony fish, also known as osteichthyes. They also have jaws and paired appendages. Difference is their mouth, like I said, faces straight out, it's terminal, and their gills are covered. So this includes all fish that have bones, which is pretty much all fish. So I gave you a few examples. I gave you the state marine fish of California, the Garibaldi, a swordfish, a close relative of the seahorse known as the leafy sea dragon, a salmon, and a dolphin fish. Next, this is our first group of tetrapods. These are the amphibians, which includes frogs and salamanders. They're characterized by having skin that's kind of slimy and moist, lacks scales, and a certain portion of their life cycle is spent in the water, so they're semi-aquatic. Next group of tetrapods is known as the reptiles. They have a scaly body. Many of them lay eggs. This includes turtles, alligators, crocodiles, lizards, and snakes. Snakes are kind of interesting because they're a tetrapod that has lost their 4 limbs. Next, we have the birds, also known as aves. And as you would expect, they're characterized by a body covered with feathers, limbs with powerful muscles so they can fly. They're warm-blooded, just like the mammals, and they usually have beaks as well. So all birds belong to this group. So I gave you a few examples here. The California condor, a brown pelican, the California least tern, and a great blue heron. And finally, we've reached our class within the chordate phylum, and that would be the mammals. So these are tetrapods that have body hair. Females have mammary glands that produce milk for their young. They're warm-blooded. They have 4-chambered hearts and relatively large brains. So it's obviously a very large group. I just gave you a few examples. Yourself, primates, humans, monkeys, dogs, cats, mice, rats, whales, bears, giraffes, lions, bats. An interesting example of a mammal that can fly. Rabbits, kangaroos, seals, elephants, dolphins. So very diverse. They live in all different types of habitats on the planet. Some live in the ocean, right? Some live on land. Those are the mammals. And the last thing I want to do is I want to give you a little tutorial on how to work through the main activity in the Animal Kingdom lab exercise. And that main activity is filling out a large table where your job is to classify and identify 30 unknown animal organisms. So as you go through the virtual lab images, you're going to open a file that looks like this. And it's a long file because a lot of the images are these 31 unknown animals. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's number 1, 2. So there's 31 of these. Now, if we were in our normal face-to-face lab setting, these would actually be there in person on the lab bench, and you would walk around and you would identify these in person. But what we've done is we've taken pictures of these organisms exactly as they would have appeared in the lab. So my goal here is to do a couple of these with you to show you how to properly fill out this table. So we're going to go through 3 examples. The first is unknown number 1. You can actually fill this out with me if you want to. Now, I picked number 1 because they gave us a terrible representation of this organism. It's lost all of its color. I don't know who took this picture, but if you can't tell, that is a jellyfish. So let me give you a better picture of a jellyfish. Let's go back here. So here we go. Remember, jellyfish are members of the Cnidarian phylum. So here's a better picture. If there was a quiz, I would give you something like this to look at. All right, so we already know it's a jellyfish. So what's next? Well, as you fill out the lab exercise, you're going to see this large table towards the end, and it looks just like this. Now, if your unknown animal is not a member of the arthropod phylum, and it's not a member of the chordate phylum, so it's any of the other 7, you only have to fill out 2 things, okay? Those 2 things are the phylum and the name, the example given. Okay, so just those 2 columns if it's not an arthropod or if it's not a chordate. So in this example number 1, we said it's a jellyfish, right, which belongs to the cnidarians. So that's not a chordate, it's not an arthropod, so we only have to fill out 2 things. And I'm going to do those with you. So you would go here, you would say, oh, it's a cnidarian. So you would type that in. Okay, so we're halfway done. Then the only other thing we have to focus on is the common name or the example given. And the example given was a jellyfish. So you're going to type in jellyfish. And there you go, that's it. All right, so that's one of them. I also picked number 13. So let's go to the images and see what number 13 looks like. So we're going to scroll down. Now, I don't expect you to know you probably know a lot of these already, but I don't expect you to know all of these unknown animals. That's why I want you to watch my video. I just took you through a lot of them, read through the slides, and complete the lab up until this point, and you'll have a pretty good idea of what these 31 organisms are. So this one, if you don't already know, is a lizard, which is a reptile. So since this is a reptile, right, it's a tetrapod, it's also a chordate. So I said if it's a chordate or an arthropod, we have to provide more information. So this is an example of that. So let me show you how to fill this out. So it's a lizard, it's a reptile, and it's a chordate. So first, just like we did before, we're going to write the phylum. So in this case, chordate. And we're going to write the common name or the example, and that would be a lizard. So what else do we need to fill out? Well, it's actually labeled here nicely. Since it is a chordate, we have to say what the subphylum, superclass, or class is. Now, it's a little confusing as this is worded here, because it kind of implies that you need to put both a subphylum, a superclass, and a class. But that's not the case. It's one of the 3. So for a lizard, it's a reptile. And if you go back in my slides, you'll see that a reptile is a class within the chordate phylum. Okay? So you'd go to class and you would write reptile. And that's it for this example. Now, sometimes instead of it being a class, for instance, it's called a superclass. So for example, if you have a hagfish or a jawless fish, that's a chordate where it's Agnatha. That's the name of the class, but it's not a class, it's a superclass, so you would write it in the superclass column. Okay, so you're only going to choose one of the 3 depending on whether it's a subphylum, a class, or a superclass. And I have one more example to go through with you, and that is number 28. So if we jump back to the pictures, and scroll down to number 28. See what I mean? You probably know that this is a fly. That's awesome. But it is a fly, and if you remember, a fly is an insect, which is also an arthropod. Okay? So if you go back in the slide, you'll see an insect as a class. So you're going to put your third set of information into the class column in this case. So we would fill this out as such. First, the phylum, which is arthropod. So remember, if it's an arthropod or a chordate, you have to tell me one more thing. The class, superclass, or subphylum. Next, the common name, you can just say fly. And lastly, the class that it belongs to, which in this case, the insects. Now, the more technical, I guess the more proper way to say these groups would be like, for instance, Insecta, or Chordata, or Arthropoda. I like to cut out as much of the Latin as I can, so don't worry about, the technical way to say it. Okay, if you say it the way I've been saying it, that's fine. That's all I'm looking for. And that's it for the video. Thanks for watching.